It's worthwhile to study dyslexia in general, but dyslexia is a common condition, and so we know it has many different causes. And so it may be that children with dyslexia have brains that look very different one from another. And so if we're looking at many different conditions and we see that the brains of kids all look different one from another, it makes it really hard to understand what's going on in any one of them because you get different results with every child you look at. So we found it was useful to look at patients where we knew they all had the same condition, and we found that the brains of patients with the same genetic condition tended to look very similar one to the next, and that helped us come to a clearer understanding of what one of the mechanisms of dyslexia can be. So there are a couple of different kinds of reading problems. You can have trouble understanding the syllables, or you can have trouble just processing information in general. The patients in this study had problems with both the analysis of word bits as well as general processing of information in general, but they especially had trouble with the kind of rapid processing that you need in order to be able to read well. Processing information is something which is very important to reading, because reading is the hardest thing that our brain does. Reading is one of the last skills that we achieve when we're growing up. We don't start to read until we're in first or second grade. And of course, it's much easier to learn to walk because we start to walk when we're only about a year old. It's much easier to learn to talk. We start to talk when we're only about 2 years old. But reading requires that we synthesize so many of the different activities that we've developed over the first 5 or 6 years of life. And it demands that we use many different parts of the brain at once. The visual part of our brain, the eye movement part of our brain, of course the linguistic part of our brain. So reading requires a tremendous amount of processing. We have to see the words, we have to parse them, we have to sort them, we have to understand them, we have to synthesize them into concepts. And then we have to do all that very quickly while our eyes are scanning across the page. Reading requires, puts tremendous demands on our brain in terms of processing information very, very quickly. The patients in our study tended to have defects in this rapid processing of information. They could process the information if you gave it to them slowly, but they couldn't put the information together fast enough to keep up with the way their eyes were scanning across the page, and that's why they tended to have such problems with reading, because their eyes were moving too fast for their brain to be able to put the information together. Dyslexics in the general population also can have processing speed abnormalities as well. Some dyslexics tend to have more of this processing speed abnormality, and other dyslexics tend to have more of the specific difficulty with word recognition. So our patients were more distinctive in having more of the processing defect and less of the word recognition problem. So our people in our study had a very particular abnormality in their brain. I think of it as a problem with the way the wires are organized. So the brain is interconnected by fibers, and the fibers act very much like wires. They carry electric current, and they connect one place to another. And as we know, wires usually travel in bundles. You see them in conduits, or you'll see them in a pipe somewhere. And in fact, in our brain, most of our wires travel in very highly organized bundles. It seems that nature has decided that that's the most efficient way for fibers to be organized in the brain, because throughout the brain you see fibers organized in these very coherent bundles. What we found was that our dyslexic patients in this study tended to have less of these very coherent bundles of fibers, and that they tended to have more places in the brain where the fibers were organized more haphazardly. And that, we think, is a much less efficient organization, and that inefficient wire organization may be why they had difficulty with the speed with which their brain could process information. So we think that having fibers that are highly organized is probably the most efficient way to wire up the brain, just as if you were wiring your house, you would want the fibers to be highly organized in order to efficiently wire your house. We think that when the fibers are more poorly organized, that they don't work quite as efficiently. They may not connect quite as accurately, or they may take roundabout routes that takes the information longer to get from one place to another. We think that these inefficiencies of wiring then generate the defects in the speed with which our patients can process information. Some other reports that have looked at dyslexics more broadly have also reported a more disorganized fiber structure to the brain. On the other hand, other reports had suggested that maybe the wires were not so disorganized. We think the reason for that apparent contradiction is that the studies have been looking at different kinds of dyslexic patients. We think that by focusing on one specific type of dyslexia, we have been able to identify a more consistent and reproducible defect. We don't think that that defect causes all of dyslexia in all patients. We think that there are probably other patients with dyslexia that might have different problems, maybe with the way the cells connect to one another, or maybe with the way the cells are located. But we do think that this wire organization issue is something which is very important, and it's very useful to be able to sort different patients into different categories to try to understand then how can we move from that sorting to understand more about the condition. So in thinking about how our findings can help dyslexia patients in the future, I think one of the most important things to understand is that in order to come to the best treatment for any patient, we have to understand as specifically as we can exactly what their problem is. And the faster we can learn what a patient's problem is, the faster we can convert that into better treatment. Tying genetics to dyslexia allows us to identify a potential problem at birth. And so that gives us the earliest possible intervention. The more we understand about other genetic causes of dyslexia, the earlier and earlier we'll be able to intervene. Early intervention is always absolutely critical in children. The other way in which our studies can help us is by helping us come to a clearer understanding of what the various forms of dyslexia can be. There are many different causes. That probably means that there are treatments that will work better for some kids than for others. The more we understand about the differences between kids, the differences in their capabilities and the differences in their limitations, the more we can understand about how to optimize the treatment of every individual kid.